December, the cold settled over the town like a heavy, dark blanket. I was working as a cleaner at a small motel on the outskirts, a place most people passed by without noticing. It wasn't much, but it was a steady job and kept me busy. I liked meeting travelers and the different faces and stories that drifted through the place. On that particular day, a small family checked in a young couple and their daughter, probably around 5 years old. She had curly hair and big brown eyes that seemed to watch everything. They seemed happy, just here to rest for a few days. They planned to stay for 3 nights, and everything seemed perfect on the first day. They explored the area a bit, and by the time they got back, they looked tired but cheerful. I cleaned their room the following morning. Making the beds and tidying up, they'd left the girl's little doll on the bed, arms stretched wide like it was welcoming her. Back, the couple was polite, even kind. They thanked me for my work, which doesn't happen often. But the night of the second day, everything changed around 2 a.m. I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. It was a desperate, panicked scream, and it seemed to echo through the empty corridors of the motel. I hurried down the hall to the source. It was the couple's room, and they were frantic, yelling about their daughter. She was gone. They said, just gone. They kept repeating, "Where is she? Where is she?" They tore through the room, looking in every corner, under the bed, even in the tiny bathroom. But she wasn't there. The night manager came to help, and soon enough the whole motel was awake. People stepped out of their rooms, rubbing their eyes and looking confused. We all began searching, combing through every hallway, every room even. Outside near the parking lot, the little girl had simply vanished without a trace. Then I realized something strange. One of our newer employees, Steve, wasn't there. Steve had joined the motel staff about a month ago, a quiet guy, who mostly kept to himself. He wasn't very talkative, never seemed to make eye contact, and always had this uneasy look about him. But he did his job, so no one questioned him much. Tonight, though, Steve was nowhere to be found. As the night dragged on, we decided to check the security cameras. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to see the nightmare that had unfolded at around 1:30 a.m. The camera caught Steve slipping into the family's room. He was silent like a shadow. A few minutes later, he emerged, and in his arms he carried something, a rolled-up mat. As he moved, the mat unfurled slightly, just enough for us to see a tiny pair of legs sticking out. The parents saw it too, and their shock turned to pure horror. The mother collapsed onto her knees, clutching her face. I felt a sick, heavy weight in my stomach. It was unthinkable that little girl who'd just been there hours before was now being taken by someone who was supposed to be part of our community, someone we trusted. The camera showed Steve slipping out the back door and heading toward the woods that bordered the motel. We immediately called the police, and within minutes they arrived, a swarm of blue and red lights flashing in the darkness. They took over, spreading out into the forest with flashlights and dogs, determined to find Steve and the little girl. The search felt endless. I could only stand there watching the lights bob in and out of the trees, listening to the barking dogs and the faint voices calling out after what felt like hours. One of the officers radioed back they'd found Steve deep in the woods near a clearing. The little girl was with him, and he wasn't alone. When the officers approached, they saw Steve talking to someone, a shadowy figure who slipped away into the darkness. As soon as the police closed in, Steve was clutching the girl, negotiating, bargaining. It looked like he was trying to sell her. My mind struggled to process that a man we'd all worked beside, someone who'd quietly scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans with the rest of us, was trying to trade a child like she was a piece of property. Thankfully, the police acted fast. They arrested Steve on the spot and rescued the girl. She was safe but shaken, clinging to the officer who brought her back to the motel. When she saw her parents, she burst into tears, running into their arms. Her mother held her like she'd never let go, and her father stood there, his face pale and frozen with shock. Back at the motel, everyone was trying to process what had happened. The police questioned each of us, trying to piece together how Steve had managed to slip past everyone, and how he'd known the family would be vulnerable. As I thought about it, the unease I'd always felt around him started to make sense. He'd watched people, studied them, just waiting for an opportunity. Steve was taken away in handcuffs, his face blank as the officers led him to the car. There wasn't a trace of remorse or fear in his eyes, just emptiness. I stood there in the cold, watching the taillights disappear down the road, and all I could feel was anger. Anger that someone could betray our trust like that, and fear that someone so close to us could hide something so dark. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family, thanks. It was November 2020, and my girlfriend Daniel and I were flying back from a weekend of camping in the Alaskan woods. After days of solitude wrapped in the quiet of endless pine trees and the cold bite of the wilderness, we were looking forward to a hot shower and a warm bed before we continued our journey back to New York. Flights were scarce, so we had to spend one last night somewhere. Before getting back to the city, we found a motel just off a long stretch of road far from anything else, and it had the bleak, cold look of a place that's seen better days. It was cheap though, and we were exhausted. The manager, an old man with a faded smile and even more faded eyes, gave us a room at the very end of the hall. As he handed over the key, he hesitated for a second, his fingers lingering on the cold metal before he looked up at us. "Listen," he began, his voice growly and quiet. "The room has 2 doors. One is the main door. You'll come in through. And the other," he paused, looking over our shoulders down the empty hallway, then back at us. "The other door leads to a storage room. It's chained shut from your side. Leave it that way." Daniel and I exchanged glances, half amused, half creeped out the way he'd said. It felt so final, so serious. We just nodded, not really thinking too much of it. Maybe the guy was just a little off. We thought. We dragged our bags down the hallway and entered our room, which was as drab as you'd expect: pale wallpaper with faded floral designs, an old TV that probably hadn't worked right since the 90s, and 2 small lamps that barely lit the room. But it was warm, and the bed looked comfortable enough. The other door stood out immediately. It was across from the bed, a sturdy wooden door with a thick chain and padlock hanging from it. The chain was heavy and rusty, as if it had been in place for years. I noticed scratch marks around the handle, deep grooves like someone or something had tried to claw its way through. I pointed it out to Daniel, and we both shrugged, assuming it was just another quirk of this rundown place. The manager's words echoed in my head, but I brushed them aside. "I mean, it's just a storage room." Right as night fell, we tried to settle in. I flipped through channels on the TV, but most were just static. Daniel curled up beside me, scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the screen. There was a quiet stillness in the room, one that seemed too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then, just past midnight, we heard a faint scratching sound, like nails lightly scraping against wood. I paused, thinking it was just the old building settling, or maybe a mouse behind the wall, but then it happened again, louder. This time I glanced at the chain door, half expecting to see it rattle, but it stayed still, heavy and unmoving, the chain glinting in the dim light. Daniel looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, feeling my heart pound a little faster, probably just the pipes or something. But it wasn't just the scratching. As the minutes passed, whispers, faint, almost inaudible, started filtering through. It sounded like someone murmuring from far away, just on the other side of that chain door. I strained to make out the words, but they were too soft, too garbled, as if they were being spoken from somewhere deep in the walls. Then came the knocking, a faint, deliberate knock, 2 taps. Then silence, another 2 taps, then nothing. It repeated every few minutes, always in pairs. It was like a message, one I couldn't understand, and it went on and on until I could hardly breathe. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to ignore it, but there was a sick sense of curiosity gnawing at me. I wanted to know what was behind that door. I wanted to know who or what was knocking around 3000. In the morning, after hours of scratching, whispers, and knocking, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity went out. I got out of bed and walked slowly to the door, feeling Daniel's eyes on my back, watching me probably. Thinking I'd lost it, I took the cold padlock in my hand, hesitating as I touched the rusty metal part of me. Wanted to leave it alone, to just go back to bed and forget any of this had happened. But I couldn't. I fumbled in my bag and found a small nail file, sliding it carefully into the lock, twisting it, until I heard a faint click. The chain slid off, and the door creaked open, revealing a room. Shrouded in darkness, I took out my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing what looked like a forgotten time capsule. Dust-covered furniture lay scattered across the floor, old rotting chairs, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, a small suitcase with stickers from the 1950s. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and something metallic like old blood. I stepped inside, trying to take it all in, and then in the dim light I saw her, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. Her outline faint but unmistakable. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden in shadow, but her eyes were there staring at me full of anger and sorrow. I froze, feeling a chill seep into my bones. She began to move her feet, not touching the floor. Her gaze locked on me as if I'd invaded her space, disturbing her peace. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in her cold, empty stare. Then she opened her mouth, but no words came out. Only a soft hissing sound, like air escaping from a broken seal. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling the room, filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe somehow. I stumbled backward, pulling the door shut behind me, locking the chain back in place. I turned to see Daniel, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. She'd seen it too. I knew she had, without a word. We grabbed our things, left the room, and didn't look back. The manager didn't say a word. As we left, didn't ask any questions. And as we drove away, the sun just starting to rise, I glanced back at the motel, wondering if anyone else had ever heard the whispers, the scratching, the knocking, wondering if anyone else had ever seen the woman in the shadows, waiting behind that door, still searching for a way out of that sealed-off room. When I checked into the motel, I only cared about getting some sleep. I'd been driving for hours on station coffee and endless highway stretches. The motel was a last-minute choice. The kind of place with flickering neon lights and peeling paint. It wasn't inviting, but I was too tired to care. The front desk guy handed me a key with a worn-out plastic tag that read Room 18. He barely looked at me and muttered something under his breath. I didn't catch it, and he seemed distracted, glancing down a dark hallway. I shrugged it off and headed to my room. Walking down the hallway, I noticed two housekeepers standing by one of the rooms with cleaning supplies in hand. It was close to midnight. Why would they be cleaning this late? But their eyes unsettled me the most. They watched me as I passed, following my every step. One of them, a short woman with stringy hair, had a strange expression. Almost a smile, but not quite. It made my skin prickle in my room. I double-locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. I didn't care about the strange housekeepers or the stale smell in the room. I just needed sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. My duffel bag, which I'd left on the floor, was now neatly placed on the table by the window. My shoes were lined up, perfectly next to the bed, and my jacket was draped over the chair. It didn't make sense. I was sure I hadn't left my things like that. At first, I thought maybe I was more exhausted than I realized and had arranged my stuff without remembering, but the more I looked around, the more it felt deliberate, like someone had carefully placed everything in a precise way. I shook it off, chalking it up to travel fatigue, and went about my day. When I returned that evening, the hallway was quiet, and I didn't see the housekeepers. Relieved, I went back to my room and locked the door, hoping for another night's rest. But the following morning, my unease turned to dread. My things had been moved again, even more noticeably this time. My toothbrush, which I'd left the bathroom sink, was now neatly placed on a folded towel beside the bed. My phone charger was unplugged and coiled on the nightstand, and a single crisp towel was left at the foot of the bed. I called the front desk, hoping for an explanation. The same guy who checked in mumbled an apology, saying he'd look into it, though it was clear he didn't care. A cold frustration settled in my chest. Something was definitely off with this place that night. I barely slept. Every creak and distant thump had me on edge, making me wonder if someone was right outside my door. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a key sliding into the lock, but when I checked, the door was still bolted. I sat on the bed, wide awake and tense, waiting for something to happen, but dawn came without incident, and I began to think I was just paranoid. When I opened my door to leave for the day, the two housekeepers were standing right outside, as if they'd been waiting for me. The short one with stringy hair, that same unreadable look, and her partner, a taller man with a shaved head, stared without blinking. Their eyes seemed hollow and cold. They didn't smile or say a word. They just watched as I walked down the hall that day. I thought about leaving. I shouldn't have to run from a cheap motel because of a couple of creepy housekeepers, but I was too tired to drive through the night. I decided to stay, keeping my phone close and planning to get a little sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of the doorknob rattling. This time it was unmistakable. Someone was trying to get in. My heart pounded as I sat up, listening. The noise stopped, but then I heard hushed whispers from the other side of the door. They sounded like they were talking, planning something. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for them to try again. After a few moments of silence, I crept to the peephole and looked out. The two housekeepers stood just inches from my door. The short woman held a key, probably the one she'd been using to get into my room. she whispered to the man, both of them looking far too calm for my liking. It clicked. They hadn't been cleaning in the middle of the night as part of their job. They were scouting, watching, and planning. Somehow I'd become their target quietly. I grabbed my bag and moved toward the window. The door was double, locked, but I wasn't taking any chances. I slipped out, dropping onto the muddy strip behind the building. I didn't care about scratches from branches or the cold